If you were to summarize, what kinds of features differentiate DPU from CPU and GPU?
This is a very good question because I believe there is quite a bit of confusion about that. At a very fundamental level, DPU or SmartNICs, more generic kind of name for it, DPU processing is mostly identical to a CPU. That implies that the processor that is sitting on the SmartNIC, the general purpose processor like ARM, for example, architecture, it's located on the network adapter and it is a regular general purpose processor with a bunch of cores, but it is optimized for I/O processing in the sense that it is tightly integrated with the actual NIC. The I/O path is more efficient than usual NIC to CPU that is going over PCI bus. And that is because it is really tightly coupled with the NIC on the same die, SoC. Now, it is emphasizing that this kind of processor is not a super powerful one, right? Because it has very clear power envelope limitations or constraints. And it's definitely very, very different from GPUs, which are entirely optimized for parallel processing. So it should be very clear that the parallel processing on GPUs requires very, very special programming model. The whole architecture is co-designed with a programming model to make it work. That is not the case for DPU that much. So let's take, for example, NVIDIA DPU. It has an ARM processor that runs Linux, right? So it's a regular operating system, embedded operating system running on the NIC. There are a few things that make DPU special. So as I mentioned, tight integration with the NIC. For example, NVIDIA Bluefield featured PCIe 4 bus interconnect at a time when it wasn't available with regular CPUs. So it does have a lot of leverage, like the vendors have a lot of leverage of being able to tightly integrate I/O with the CPU. So more importantly, SmartNIC vendors can tightly integrate a bunch of accelerators that they can plug into the same SoC, which essentially play a really crucial role for the performance of DPUs or SmartNICs. The ARM processor itself are not powerful enough for compute-intensive tasks, and instead the use of hardware accelerators is really essential to achieve high performance. So this kind of flexibility is for the vendors. This is what makes it really customizable for a particular market domain that different vendors can go after. Another important aspect is the ability to represent a NIC as something else, meaning that when you plug in this SmartNIC into your server, it can show as if it's a storage adapter. Again, this is really important because what you can do is leverage all the virtualization hardware that is already in place there in order to offload a bunch of disaggregation logic that you can do, so that basically it allows one to easily implement remote access to storage without involving the upper level of the stack of the tenants, for example. So these features basically enable the NIC vendors to introduce compute offloads that are really, really needed for data centers. Another important aspect in DPUs is that unlike GPUs, at least from NVIDIA, they have a what is called air-gapped security property. So air-gapped security means that the DPU is an independent processor with a secure or measured boot. That is, it boots very, very specific version of the operating system, highly guarded by the vendor. It runs very, very specific software stack, and it can, in principle, be entirely independent of the host CPU. So you plug this card in, and the CPU cannot interfere with it, right? So it basically controls its own. And in addition, you can think about this as a really small computer sitting inside a large host computer. And this in turn offers a pretty unique security property to the table. The host cannot break into the software stack on the DPU, and the DPU is sitting pretty much on the firehose of all the network traffic to the host. So it is really positioned well to serve as an infrastructure processor that is trusted by the infrastructure and that is basically isolated from the host. And again, there is this term air-gapped, right? Because there's no direct access from the host to the NIC. Also, it does not share any hardware with the DPU. So the CPU and DPU do not share any hardware. They communicate through the bus. So the CPU cannot perform what is called side channel attacks as effectively. Not all of them, but basically most of them are not applicable to SmartNICs because they do not share any piece of hardware with the CPU. And that altogether makes it pretty interesting platform to implement infrastructure trusted solution, which are completely isolated from the host software.